Chapter 1. On the Experience of Moral Confusion. David Graeber begins with a conversation that exposes the unusual moral force of debt. At a gathering in London, he explains to an activist lawyer how international financial institutions had enforced repayment on poor countries through austerity programs. Governments were required to cut food subsidies, healthcare, education, and other basic services in order to satisfy foreign creditors. The lawyer listens sympathetically, but when Graeber proposes debt cancellation, she replies with what appears to be an obvious principle: one has to pay one's debts. Graeber treats this reaction as the book's central puzzle. The statement sounds economic, but it is fundamentally moral. A debt is not merely an amount owed. It carries an accusation. The debtor has made a promise, accepted a benefit, and failed to fulfill an obligation. That moral language can make even severe punishment appear legitimate. Graeber recalls that budget cuts imposed on Madagascar helped end a malaria control program and contributed to thousands of deaths. Yet those deaths could be presented as regrettable necessities because the country owed money. The book therefore asks why debt has a moral authority that other economic claims do not. Standard lending theory assumes that creditors accept risk. If repayment were guaranteed regardless of the quality of the loan, lenders would have little reason to exercise judgment. Bankruptcy laws recognize this principle. Nevertheless, at the international level, powerful creditors often arranged for governments and institutions to enforce loans that had been made irresponsibly, sometimes to dictators who diverted the proceeds. The population, rather than the borrower or lender, then bore the cost. Graeber's broader claim is that debt can transform relationships created by coercion into relationships that appear voluntary. Conquest, tribute, slavery, and extraction can be rewritten as obligations between formally equal parties. Once an amount has been quantified, the creditor can say that violence is not being imposed arbitrarily, it is merely enforcing a contract. Throughout history, Graeber argues, the language of debt has repeatedly been used to make unequal power appear morally exact. This does not mean that all debts are illegitimate, or that promises never matter. The point is that the phrase, "one has to pay one's debts," suppresses the questions that should come first. Who created the obligation? Did both parties act freely? Did the lender understand the risk? Has the borrower already repaid the principal several times through interest? What kinds of consequences are acceptable in order to collect? Most societies have recognized limits, because unlimited enforcement can destroy families, communities, and political orders. Ancient rulers understood this danger. Mesopotamian kings periodically canceled consumer debts, freed debt servants, and returned land. Biblical traditions preserved the ideal of the Jubilee. Such measures were not considered attacks on economic order. They were methods of restoring it when compounding obligations threatened to reduce free cultivators to dependency. Graeber notes that many languages connect debt with guilt, sin, and redemption. Financial and religious vocabularies repeatedly overlap because both concern obligations, judgment, punishment, and release. The modern financial crisis provides the immediate setting for the book. Before 2008, banks created enormous volumes of claims through mortgages, derivatives, and other instruments. When the system failed, governments rescued the financial institutions while offering far less relief to ordinary debtors. The result was morally revealing. Institutions that had demanded personal responsibility from borrowers were protected from the consequences of their own decisions. Debtors, meanwhile, were told that contracts remain sacred. Graeber sees this asymmetry as evidence that debt is inseparable from power. A small debtor is disciplined by a creditor. A sufficiently large debtor may force creditors and governments to reorganize the system around its survival. The familiar proverb captures the point. If one owes a bank a modest sum, the bank owns the debtor. If one owes an enormous sum, the debtor may effectively own the bank. The crisis also showed that money itself is less solid than it appears. Trillions of dollars could be created, guaranteed, or extinguished through political decisions. Modern money is largely credit recorded electronically, not a stock of metal passing from hand to hand. Graeber argues that this is not historically unprecedented. Virtual money, accounts, and credit arrangements existed long before coins. History repeatedly alternates between periods dominated by credit and periods dominated by bullion. The book will use that long history to challenge several myths: that barter came before money, that markets and states arose independently, and that all human obligations can be understood as exchange. Graeber's aim is not merely to describe financial techniques. He wants to ask what people truly owe one another, why some obligations become measurable debts, and what forms of freedom might exist beyond the opposition between an impersonal market and an all-encompassing state. Graeber supports this argument with a longer history of debt relief. The Sumerian term amargai, sometimes translated as freedom, literally referred to a return to the mother and was used for decrees that released debt servants and restored families. Later Babylonian rulers proclaimed similar clean slates when ascending the throne or after crises. The measures recognized that personal debts could not be allowed to accumulate without limit because the result was not an efficient market but the disappearance of independent households. Farmers abandoned fields, joined nomadic groups, or became dependents of creditors. The ruler then lost taxpayers, workers, and soldiers. Biblical rules of sabbatical release and jubilee preserve the same concern in religious form. The ideal was a periodic return of land and liberation of those held for debt. Even when such rules were not fully implemented, they established that creditor claims were subordinate to the continued existence of the community. Graeber contrasts this with modern discourse, where cancellation is often treated as an impossible violation of morality, while the social consequences of collection are treated as external details. The chapter also introduces a definition that guides the rest of the book. Debt is a promise corrupted by mathematics and violence. A promise is a relation between people whose circumstances can change, and who can renegotiate what they owe each other. Once the obligation is converted into a number, it can be transferred to strangers and enforced without regard to the original relationship. Violence, or the credible threat of it, allows the number to prevail when the debtor resists. Chapter 2. The Myth of Barter. Graeber begins his reconstruction of money by distinguishing debt from obligation. Many obligations cannot be measured precisely. A debt, by contrast, is an obligation expressed as an exact quantity. Money makes this quantification possible. For that reason, the history of debt is necessarily a history of money. Economics textbooks usually tell a different story. They begin with barter. In a moneyless village, one person has shoes and wants grain, while another has grain but does not want shoes. Because exchange requires a double coincidence of wants, people supposedly select a widely accepted commodity as a medium. Money appears first, credit develops later, and modern banking comes last. Graeber emphasizes that this is normally presented as an imaginary exercise, not as a conclusion drawn from evidence. Economists ask readers to imagine a modern market with money removed. They then treat the inconvenience of that imagined system as the historical cause of money. Yet anthropologists have searched for societies organized around ordinary barter and have not found them. In communities where people know one another, exchange usually occurs through credit, delayed reciprocity, redistribution, customary obligations, or open-ended mutual aid. A neighbor who needs food is not normally required to produce an immediately equivalent object. The giver may remember the favor, but the relation remains socially embedded, and the value is rarely calculated with precision. Barter does occur, but most often between strangers, enemies, or people who do not expect an enduring relationship. It can also appear when people accustomed to money temporarily lack currency. It is not the original foundation of everyday economic life. Graeber traces the conventional story to Adam Smith. Smith wanted to establish an autonomous domain of economic behavior, rooted in a natural human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. On this account, markets, property, and money emerge before government. The state later protects arrangements that individuals have already created. This argument helped define economics as a separate science governed by its own laws. The difficulty is that Smith's historical examples do not support the theory. Communities said to use nails, tobacco, cod, or other goods as money were often operating credit systems denominated in conventional currency. Workers whose wages had been delayed might use leftover nails to settle a tavern account. Fishermen in Newfoundland sold catches at prices recorded in pounds, shillings, and pence, then used book credit to obtain supplies. Tobacco laws in colonial Virginia required merchants to accept the crop against debts. The goods were not evidence of a society moving from barter toward money. They were ways of settling accounts when coins were scarce. Anthropological cases tell the same story. When unfamiliar groups meet, ceremonial exchange, feasting, sexual display, games, and potential violence, may accompany direct swapping. These encounters differ sharply from the impersonal market imagined by textbooks. Within the community, by contrast, people maintain long chains of obligation without demanding immediate settlement. The strongest evidence comes from ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest written documents are largely accounts. Temples and palaces recorded rations, rents, wages, loans, and obligations in units of barley and silver. The silver shekel functioned as a unit of account, but most people rarely used silver in daily transactions. Debts could be paid with grain, animals, labor, or other goods. Alehouse customers ran tabs and settled them after harvest. Merchants used credit extensively. This system existed thousands of years before the first coins. Money therefore began not as a commodity selected from barter, but as an accounting relation. Units such as the shekel allowed institutions and individuals to compare obligations. Physical silver could settle balances, especially in long-distance trade, but it did not have to circulate for the monetary system to function. Graeber draws on the credit theorist Alfred Mitchell Innes, who argued that money is fundamentally an acknowledgement of debt. An IOU can circulate if others trust the issuer. If one person gives another a written promise, the recipient can transfer it to a third party who can use it to cancel a different obligation. The instrument functions as money for as long as it is accepted. Coins themselves can be understood in similar terms because their value usually depends on the authority willing to receive them for taxes and other payments, not merely on their metallic content. The historical sequence is therefore largely the reverse of the textbook account. Credit systems came first. Coinage appeared much later and never eliminated credit. Barter generally emerged at the margins of monetary systems or during their breakdown. Graeber argues that the persistence of the barter myth reflects its ideological usefulness. It portrays markets as natural products of individual exchange and government as an external addition. The evidence instead suggests that money, law, taxation, political authority, and credit develop together. Graeber gives special attention to barter among strangers. Anthropological descriptions of exchange between groups such as the Gunwingu of Australia show that trade could be embedded in dance, feasting, mock aggression, sexual negotiation, and ritual. The event created a temporary social world in which people who might otherwise be enemies could interact. It bears little resemblance to isolated individuals silently comparing utility. Another pattern appears when monetary systems break down. People accustomed to prices may directly exchange goods, but they normally continue using money as a unit of account. During shortages, a person may swap a chicken for work while thinking of both in dollars or another familiar currency. This is barter generated by money, not a stage before it. The Mesopotamian evidence also shows why physical coins were unnecessary. Temple workers received standardized barley rations. The silver shekel was defined relative to grain and divided according to the sexagesimal system that survives in the 60-minute hour. Prices outside the institutional sector could fluctuate, but the accounting unit supplied a common language. A farmer could discharge a silver-denominated obligation with barley because the unit measured value rather than specifying the object of payment. Long-distance merchants were more likely to carry metal because they dealt across communities. Even then, they relied heavily on partnership and credit. Graeber's point is not that barter never existed, or that silver was irrelevant. It is that the textbook sequence mistakes a secondary and often marginal practice for the universal origin of economic life. Chapter 3. Primordial Debts. Having rejected the barter origin story, Graeber examines an opposing theory: money as the creation of states and debt as the foundation of society. Credit theorists define money as an abstract measure of obligations. State theorists add that governments give those units general force by demanding payment in them. A government can issue tokens, declare that taxes must be paid with those tokens, and spin them into circulation by paying soldiers and officials. Subjects then need the currency and will provide goods or labor to obtain it. On this account, taxes do not merely finance government after money already exists. Tax obligations help create a market for the state's money. Graeber uses colonial examples to show the mechanism clearly. European administrations in Africa sometimes imposed hut taxes payable only in colonial currency. Africans then had to sell produce or work for wages in mines and plantations to acquire the money. The stated purpose was often to create markets and labor discipline. Currency, taxation, and coercion arrived as a package. This insight challenges the idea that markets and states are opposites. States have repeatedly created markets, and markets depend on legal and coercive institutions. Yet Graeber does not accept the full state theory as an origin story. The existence of accounting systems before centralized states and the variety of local credit arrangements make any single origin unlikely. Money has never been one thing. The chapter then turns to theories of primordial debt, especially those developed by French thinkers associated with Michel Aglietta and André Orléans. They argue that society begins not with exchange among independent individuals, but with an obligation that precedes individuality. Each person is born owing life, language, culture, and protection to the community. Money represents and administers this original social debt. Taxes are payments toward an obligation that can never be fully discharged. Such theories draw support from ancient religious language. Vedic texts describe human beings as born with debts to gods, sages, ancestors, and humanity. Sacrifice repays the gods, study repays the sages, children repay the ancestors, and hospitality repays humanity. Similar ideas appear in many traditions, where life is treated as a loan and death as repayment. Graeber argues, however, that these obligations are not debts in the commercial sense. They cannot be quantified, transferred, or finally settled. One repays parents by raising children, not by returning an equivalent benefit to the same persons. One honors humanity by acting humanely toward others. These acts express continuity rather than exchange. Indeed, the religious argument may undermine the very idea of debt. A commercial transaction assumes that the parties are separate and potentially equal. But an individual cannot stand outside the universe and negotiate with it. If everything includes oneself, there is no independent creditor to repay. The attempt to calculate an infinite obligation is conceptually absurd. The political danger appears when an institution claims to speak for society, humanity, or the cosmos. If the debt is infinite, whoever represents the creditor can demand unlimited payment. Priests, rulers, and states can convert an unmeasurable relation into taxes, sacrifice, military service, or obedience. Graeber argues that the modern language of social debt emerged with the nation-state. Thinkers such as Auguste Comte rejected individual rights and emphasized duties to the society that formed each person. Later nationalists and socialists used similar reasoning. Citizens had been educated, protected, and created by the nation. Therefore, they owed service in return. The state presented itself as administrator of society's claim. This culminates in a nationalist transformation of religious sacrifice. Once people owed their lives to gods and paid interest through offerings, modern citizens owe their lives to the nation, pay interest through taxes, and may be required to repay the principal by dying in war. Graeber does not deny mutual dependence. He disputes the assumption that the state has an exclusive right to calculate and collect what that dependence supposedly requires. The barter myth and the primordial debt myth appear opposed, but they reinforce a false choice. One begins with autonomous individuals who owe nothing until they contract. The other begins with an infinite obligation to a collective represented by government. The first naturalizes the market. The second naturalizes the state. Modern political thought repeatedly presents these as the only possibilities. Graeber's alternative is that human beings enter many kinds of relationships that cannot be reduced either to free exchange or to total social debt. People cooperate, care, command, share, compete, and submit under different moral principles. Markets and states are historically intertwined arrangements within that wider field, not timeless foundations of society. The chapter therefore prepares the next stage of the argument. To understand debt, one must stop treating all obligations as versions of exchange. The central question is not whether society begins with individual barter or collective indebtedness. It is how particular social relations become measurable, transferable, and enforceable as debts, and who gains the authority to perform that conversion. Credit theorists sharpen the argument by separating the unit of account from the object used in payment. A dollar is comparable to an inch or an hour, an abstract measure, not a physical substance. Notes, coins, and electronic entries are instruments denominated in that unit. What they have in common is that others accept them in settlement. The state theory associated with Georg Friedrich Knapp emphasizes that the decisive obligation is taxation. A ruler may stamp otherwise unimpressive objects and then accept them for taxes. The population will value them, because everyone needs them to satisfy the state. This explains why ancient coins could circulate above their metal content, and why governments could sometimes issue emergency coins made from base metal. Graeber also discusses the economist Charles Goodhart's distinction between market-selected money and money created through political boundaries. The evidence favors a world in which currencies are connected to jurisdictions, accounting communities, and enforceable obligations. But no authority possesses complete control. Private credit constantly creates additional money, and political struggles determine which promises will be honored. Primordial debt theories correctly insist that individuals do not create themselves. Language, knowledge, care, and infrastructure are inherited from others. Graeber's objection is to turning that dependence into an account administered by a sovereign. An infinite debt cannot produce a specific tax rate or command without a political act. The calculation is not discovered, it is imposed. Chapter 4. Cruelty and Redemption. Graeber now addresses the apparent conflict between commodity theories and credit theories of money. His answer is that money has usually contained both elements. A coin is a valuable object, but it is also a political token whose face value is supported by an authority. Credit works most easily within communities of trust. Bullion is especially useful across political boundaries or between strangers who do not trust one another. This double character explains why historical monetary systems contain many overlapping forms. Local shop tokens, tally sticks, tabs, and private notes can circulate within a community because people know who will accept them. Precious metal is more useful for distant transactions because it retains value outside the issuing network. Money continually moves between social promise and impersonal commodity. Graeber then examines Friedrich Nietzsche's attempt to derive morality from the creditor-debtor relationship. Nietzsche noted that the German word for debt also means guilt. He imagined early creditors taking pleasure in punishing defaulting debtors, and suggested that law, conscience, and moral obligation arose from practices of measuring injury and inflicting equivalent pain. Graeber considers Nietzsche's history largely speculative, but valuable because it reveals the violence hidden inside commercial language. A debt begins as an agreement between apparent equals. When the debtor cannot pay, equality gives way to domination. The creditor claims the right to seize land, labor, family members, or the debtor's body. Quantification provides a bridge between contract and punishment. Ancient legal and religious texts repeatedly connect debt with bodily suffering, slavery, and redemption. Default could lead to imprisonment, torture, sale of children, or debt bondage. The language of redemption originally referred to buying someone back from captivity. Religious traditions later transformed these material practices into metaphors of sin and salvation. Christian teachings illustrate the ambivalence. The Lord's Prayer asks forgiveness of debts as believers forgive their debtors. Jesus calls for cancellation, mercy, and release. Yet the same commercial imagery can turn spiritual life into an account of sins, penalties, and final judgment. Religion protests the market while borrowing its vocabulary. Graeber argues that debt generated especially powerful protest because it presupposed equality. A slave or hereditary subordinate was officially inferior. A debtor, however, began as an equal party to a contract. When a poor farmer borrowed from a wealthy neighbor and later lost land or children, the transaction could be experienced as betrayal. The creditor defended enforcement by appealing to the contract. The debtor replied that members of the same community had obligations that came before calculation. This is why ancient class conflicts so often centered on debt cancellation. Debtors demanded the destruction of records, release from bondage, and restoration of land. Prophets and reformers could support them because the creditor's claim rested on a moral equality that enforcement itself destroyed. The history of social justice, therefore, inherits much of its language from struggles over debt, bondage and freedom, guilt and forgiveness, redemption and release. Graeber closes the chapter by returning to ancient rebellion. In Mesopotamia, Israel, Greece, Rome, India, and China, popular demands often repeated the same combination: cancel the debts, free those held in bondage, and redistribute or restore the land. These were not campaigns against obligation in general. They asserted that the community's survival and the equal standing of its members outweighed the creditor's mathematical claim. The concept of redemption carries this history. To redeem a person was to purchase freedom from captivity or debt bondage. Religious redemption later described liberation from sin or death, but the metaphor retained the structure of a financial release. Graeber argues that many modern ideals of emancipation descend from these material struggles over whether human beings can be treated as collateral. Chapter 5. A brief treatise on the moral grounds of economic relations. Graeber pauses the historical narrative to build a theory of everyday economic morality. If debt is only one kind of obligation, then it must be distinguished from other principles that govern how people give, take, share, and command. He proposes three recurring moral logics: communism, exchange, and hierarchy. All societies contain all three, and people move among them constantly. By communism, Graeber does not mean a state that owns all property, or a fully planned economy. He means the principle of giving according to ability and receiving according to need. This appears wherever people cooperate toward a common task or respond directly to another person's need. In a workshop, someone asks for a tool and another person passes it without demanding an equivalent object. During a disaster, strangers share food, shelter, and information. Within households and close communities, many resources circulate this way. Graeber calls the minimal version baseline communism. It rests on the assumption that, unless there is a special reason not to, people should provide modest assistance when the cost is small and the need is clear. Asking directions, requesting a light, or passing food at a table usually does not create a precisely measured debt. The assistance is justified by a shared humanity, and by the expectation that anyone in a similar position would do the same. This principle is not necessarily warm or egalitarian. Soldiers, corporations, and criminal organizations also depend on internal cooperation. People may share intensely within a group while treating outsiders with hostility. Communism describes a mode of coordination, not a complete moral ideal. Exchange operates differently. It concerns equivalence and balance. Each party gives something and expects a comparable return. Commercial exchange is the clearest case because the transaction can be completed and the parties can walk away. A debt is an exchange that has not yet been brought back into balance. During the interval, creditor and debtor are unequal. Once payment is made, equality is restored and the relationship can end. Not all exchange is immediate or impersonal. Friends may take turns buying meals without calculating exact prices. Gifts may be reciprocated after long intervals. Competitive generosity can produce escalating cycles in which each participant tries to surpass the other. In heroic societies, chiefs demonstrate superiority by giving more than rivals can return. The logic remains reciprocal, but equality may be pursued through contest rather than precise equivalence. Graeber notes that exchange can become hostile. Retaliation is negative reciprocity. Injury is return for injury. Feuds, revenge, and the principle of an eye for an eye all seek balance. The same moral image of symmetry can justify both fairness and brutality. Hierarchy rests not on equivalence, but on precedent and status. A superior gives one kind of thing, and a subordinate gives another. The relation is expected to continue rather than close. Peasants provide labor or produce to a lord, while the lord claims to provide protection and order. Parents care for children, who may later honor or support them, but the acts are not equivalent exchanges between interchangeable persons. In hierarchical relations, repeated action becomes custom. A gift from a superior may establish what the subordinate can expect. A service from below may establish what is owed upward. The first act becomes a model for the next. This is why rulers often present extraction as benevolence. The king's feast, protection, or ritual generosity confirms his elevated position, while the subject's tribute confirms theirs. Graeber uses everyday etiquette to show how the logics overlap. Saying please disguises a command as a request. Saying thank you can symbolically acknowledge a debt, while the response, it was nothing, denies that an account has been opened. Middle-class politeness often treats small acts of baseline communism as momentary exchanges, immediately recording and canceling tiny obligations. The moral meaning of an action, therefore, depends on the relationship. Giving food to a hungry child is care. Giving food to a colleague may be mutual aid. Giving food to a customer is sale. Giving food to a ruler may be tribute. The physical transfer can be identical while the social logic differs completely. Problems arise when people disagree about which logic applies. A wealthy person may define a loan to a poor relative as a commercial contract. The borrower may understand it as family assistance. An employer may describe obedience as a freely purchased service. A worker may see it as domination. Political conflicts often concern not only the distribution of goods, but the moral category into which a relationship should fall. Graeber applies this framework to the famous anthropological literature on gifts. Marcel Mauss showed that gifts can create durable obligations, but later theorists often reduced all sociality to reciprocal exchange. Graeber argues that this reproduces the market assumption it was meant to challenge. Much giving is not intended to produce an equivalent return. It may express care, superiority, solidarity, dependence, or membership. The story of Ernest Thompson Seton illustrates the boundary. On Seton's 21st birthday, his father presented him with an itemized bill for the costs of raising him. Seton paid, but then ended the relationship. The bill was offensive, precisely because calculating and settling the account implied that father and son could now walk away as strangers. What had been understood as an enduring relation of care was reclassified as a commercial exchange. Graeber concludes with Rabelais' comic praise of debt. The character Panurge argues that debt binds the universe together, because creditors care about the survival of those who owe them. Pantagruel rejects the idea and cancels Panurge debts, invoking the principle that people should owe one another only mutual love and affection. The episode captures Graeber's larger point. Human interdependence is real, but calling every connection a debt imports the logic of calculation and potential enforcement into relations that may rest on entirely different moral grounds. Graeber illustrates baseline communism with the maxim that from each comes according to ability and to each according to need. The formula describes what people ordinarily do when cooperating, not only what revolutionaries imagine for an entire society. A mechanic reaching for a wrench is given the appropriate tool, not one calculated to match a previous contribution. The group's success depends on responding to the task. The scale of this communism can expand suddenly. After earthquakes, floods, or blackouts, people often organize food, transport, rescue, and information without waiting for prices. Graeber notes that political authorities sometimes fear this spontaneous coordination because it reveals capacities that ordinary institutions suppress. The same people represented as selfish consumers can act as practical communists when necessity makes interdependence visible. Relations of exchange, by contrast, are most comfortable between equals who can separate. The exactness of the account is a measure of distance. Friends may avoid calculation because insisting on precise equivalence would imply distrust or a desire to end the relation. Strangers in a shop can calculate exactly because neither expects an enduring personal bond. Gifts occupy an intermediate space. A gift that must be repaid immediately is barely a gift. Delay keeps the relation open. In some societies, ceremonial exchange creates alliances through alternating acts of generosity. In others, aristocrats compete to overwhelm one another with gifts that cannot be matched. Reciprocity can therefore sustain equality or manufacture rank. Hierarchy reverses the expectation that like should answer like. A superior's generosity is answered by loyalty, labor, or deference. The difference in what each gives confirms the difference in what each is. This is why a king can present taxes as the people's return for protection, even though the quantities and services are not negotiated between equals. The three logics are not stages of development. A modern corporation may organize teamwork communistically within a department, purchase inputs through exchange, and command employees hierarchically. A family may share food by need, exchange favors among adult relatives, and impose parental authority on children. Moral life is complicated because any event can be interpreted through several logics at once. Graeber's framework also clarifies the language of fairness. People sometimes demand equality, meaning equal shares. At other times, they demand proportionality, meaning rewards according to contribution. In emergencies, they may demand priority for those in greatest need. No single formula covers all cases. Political arguments often become attempts to establish which moral principle should govern a particular resource. Graeber stresses that none of these principles is intrinsically good or bad. Baseline communism can sustain care and cooperation, but it can also operate inside armies or criminal organizations whose solidarity is directed against outsiders. Exchange can protect autonomy by allowing two parties to settle their accounts and separate, but it can also turn revenge into an endless search for equivalence. Hierarchy can support durable responsibilities, as between adults and children, but it can also naturalize exploitation by presenting unequal treatment as the proper consequence of rank. The practical issue is therefore not to choose one principle for every social situation. It is to ask which principle people are invoking and whether that interpretation is accepted by everyone involved. A request for repayment can appear perfectly reasonable if both parties understood a transaction as exchange. The same request can appear monstrous if one party believed the relation was based on care or solidarity. Graeber sees many political conflicts as struggles over this classification. Employers describe wages as equivalent payment for freely chosen labor, while workers may emphasize the hierarchy created inside the workplace. Governments describe taxes as a return for public services, while citizens may understand them as contributions to a common project or as tribute imposed from above. This framework also explains why exact accounting often signals the weakening of a relationship. People who expect to remain connected can tolerate imbalance because future circumstances will create new occasions for giving. Precise settlement is most necessary where trust is low, or where the parties wish to become strangers again. Debt is especially dangerous because it combines the language of equality with a period of legally enforceable inequality. The creditor and debtor are equal enough to make a contract, but the contract then authorizes one to command aspects of the other's future. Chapter 6. Games with Sex and Death. Graeber next examines societies in which money is used less to buy objects than to create and rearrange relations among people. He calls these human economies. Their currencies may include shells, cloth, metal rods, livestock, or other valuables, but such objects are often reserved for marriages, funerals, compensation, initiation, political alliances, and the settlement of injuries. They are social currencies rather than ordinary means of shopping. This matters because conventional economic history tends to erase women, children, slaves, and family relations. It imagines adult men trading objects for mutual advantage, while many of the most important historical uses of money concerned marriage, paternity, blood compensation, ransom, and bondage. Money repeatedly appears at the boundary between the recognition that a person is unique and the attempt to assign that person a value. Marriage payments provide a clear example. Colonial observers often interpreted bride wealth as the purchase of a woman. Anthropologists objected that marriage does not give a husband the unrestricted right to dispose of his wife as property. The payment instead establishes relations between families and helps determine the status of children. It acknowledges that one group is surrendering claims over a person whose value cannot actually be measured. Graeber draws on Philippe Rospabe as argument that such money represents debts that cannot be paid. A life cannot be replaced by a quantity of shells or cattle. Compensation does not establish a true equivalent. It marks the existence of an obligation and prevents violence from continuing. Social currency is therefore an inadequate substitute by design. Its insufficiency recognizes the uniqueness of the person. Among the Lele of the Congo, raffia cloth circulated in systems of marriage and blood compensation. A man who obtained a wife incurred obligations to the woman's kin. Death or injury could create claims that move through a network of families. Women could become pawns or dependents within these arrangements, but the cloth did not function like cash in an open commodity market. It organized claims over persons, descendants, and alliances. The Tiv of Nigeria used brass rods in what Graeber describes as a flesh debt system. The rods could arrange marriages and settle certain obligations, while rights over women and children moved among kin groups. Tiv accounts emphasize the fear that powerful figures could transform social claims into predatory control. Stories of witches consuming human substance expressed anxieties about people who converted the vitality of others into personal power. Such systems could be oppressive, but Graeber distinguishes them from commercial slavery. Within a human economy, a person remains embedded in a network of social identities and claims. To make someone a commodity, those connections must be cut. Violence performs that work. A captive is removed from family, community, ancestry, and legal protection, then rendered exchangeable with other captives. The Atlantic slave trade shows what happens when commercial economies penetrate human economies. European merchants offered guns, cloth, metal, and other goods in return for people. African rulers and traders often drew captives from warfare, judicial punishment, pawning, and existing forms of dependency. Yet the scale of external demand transformed these institutions. Obligations that had once rearranged relations within communities became channels through which human beings were exported permanently. Debt played a central role. Individuals could be pledged as security. Families might surrender dependents during famine or crisis. Rulers borrowed imported goods and repaid with captives. As violence expanded, communities needed weapons for protection, which created further pressure to acquire goods through the sale of people. Commercial exchange and political insecurity reinforced each other. Graeber rejects simple stories in which money peacefully develops from trade. In these cases, the decisive transition is from a social token that acknowledges an unpayable human obligation to a price that makes persons alienable. The conversion requires force. Someone must be able to seize, transport, confine, and punish the person being sold. The chapter also explains the historical association of money with sex and death. Marriage creates new persons and affiliations. Funerals and blood payments respond to the loss of persons. Slavery turns persons into transferable objects. Social currencies move among these domains because they address the creation, destruction, and reclassification of human beings. Graeber's conclusion is not that human economies were peaceful worlds corrupted by commerce. They contain hierarchy, patriarchy, and violence. The narrower claim is that commercial value operates differently. It abstracts persons from relationships and makes them comparable. When combined with organized violence, debt and money can transform temporary dependency into permanent alienation. Graeber develops the concept of human economies through additional examples. In many systems, compensation for homicide does not mean that the victim's life has been bought. Payment acknowledges that no payment can restore the dead and gives the bereaved family a reason not to continue a feud. The object transferred is a visible sign of a relationship that will remain morally incomplete. Marriage transactions work similarly. When valuables move from a husband's family to a wife's family, they do not normally give the husband an unrestricted right to sell her. They establish claims concerning residence, children, inheritance, and assistance between kin groups. Colonial officials misunderstood these payments because they assumed that any quantified transfer must be a purchase. Among the Lele, raffia cloth could settle blood obligations, arrange marriages, and create rights over dependents. The same pieces moved through many relationships, but their significance depended on the persons involved. A cloth given for a bride did not place a price on her labor in the manner of a market wage. It recognized that her movement changed the composition and future of two groups. The Tiv brass rod system was more unstable. Men sought rods to acquire wives, but acquiring rods often required claims over women. Debts could circulate until the obligation seemed to rest on a human life rather than an object. Tiv stories of flesh-eating witches portrayed powerful people as secretly consuming the life force of others. Graeber reads this imagery as a moral critique of accumulation in a society where wealth could be converted into control over persons. European traders entered these systems with goods that could be exchanged for captives. The demand for slaves made it profitable to reinterpret judicial penalties, pawning, and political dependency as sources of exportable property. People accused of crimes or witchcraft, seized in war, or pledged for debts could be detached from local claims and sold. The process could become self-reinforcing. Communities sought weapons because neighboring communities possessed them. Weapons were purchased with captives. Raids and accusations generated more captives, producing further insecurity. Credit advanced by merchants increased pressure on rulers to deliver people. The resulting violence destroyed the very social networks that had previously limited alienation. Graeber describes slavery as social death. The slave is not defined only by forced labor, but by separation from recognized ancestry, kin, and political identity. A person can be bought because violence has first made that person a stranger. Commercial exchange then treats this destruction of relationship as a normal transfer of property. He connects this history to modern debt bondage. Migrant workers may borrow large sums for recruitment and transport, then find themselves legally and geographically dependent on employers. The forms differ from chattel slavery, but the combination of debt, movement away from protective networks, and coercive control follows a familiar pattern. Graeber uses Philippe Robespierre's theory to clarify why social currencies can represent people without pricing them. In marriage payments, The valuables do not purchase a woman as one purchases livestock. They acknowledge that a family is receiving something for which no material equivalent exists: a new person, new reproductive possibilities, and a rearrangement of kinship. The only true equivalent for a person would be another person. Money, therefore, marks an obligation that remains open rather than extinguishing it. The same logic appears in blood wealth. Cattle, shells, or metal objects offered after a killing cannot replace the dead. Their purpose is to recognize the loss, restrain vengeance, and preserve relations between groups that would otherwise enter a feud. Among the newer, the standard payment for a life could also become the bride wealth used to establish a marriage in the dead person's name. Children born from this arrangement were socially attributed to the deceased. The payment did not calculate the price of a life. It helped create a life that could continue the victim's social existence. These examples show why violence is the decisive boundary. A human economy treats each person as a unique intersection of relations, and its currencies record changes in those relations. To transform a person into a commodity, those connections must first be broken. Captives are removed from families, names, and political communities. Debtors are isolated from those who might protect them. Accusations, raids, and judicial punishments provide a language for declaring someone transferable. Graeber argues that the Atlantic slave trade intensified this process by connecting local systems of obligation to external commercial demand. European merchants supplied goods and weapons on credit and demanded captives in repayment. African rulers and traders then sought people who could be represented as outsiders, criminals, witches, or debtors. The result was not simply the purchase of an already existing category of slaves. Commercial pressure helped produce the category by generating warfare, insecurity, and social rupture. Chapter 7. Honor and Degradation, or On the Foundations of Contemporary Civilization. Graeber develops the relationship among debt, honor, patriarchy, slavery, property, and freedom. The chapter ranges from early medieval Ireland through Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, to show that concepts now treated as universal often emerged from societies structured by the power to own people. Honor begins as a claim to dignity recognized by others. It is both personal and measurable. A person of honor possesses standing, credibility, and the capacity to defend a reputation. Because honor depends on public recognition, insult can create an obligation for compensation or revenge. Graeber describes honor as surplus dignity. Everyone may possess a basic human worth, but honorable persons claim more. Aristocratic honor is inseparable from the ability to command dependents and protect a household. A man unable to defend his family, repay obligations, or answer insults loses standing. Early Irish law made this explicit through the honor price. Every free person had a legally defined value according to rank. Insult, injury, or death required compensation based on that amount. Kings and nobles had high honor prices. Dependents had lower ones. The system did not reduce persons to ordinary commodities, because the payment represented status and social relations. Yet it established a bridge between personal dignity and monetary calculation. The language of credit preserves this connection. A person with credit is believed and trusted. Financial credit depends on reputation, while social honor depends on the ability to fulfill obligations. Default is therefore not merely a financial failure. It can become degradation. In Mesopotamia, Graeber connects the rise of commercial debt to the development of patriarchy. Early urban economies were dominated by temples and palaces, but private lending expanded. During debt crises, farmers could lose fields, wives, sons, and daughters to creditors. Periodic clean slates attempted to restore households before these processes destroyed the free population. Women's status became increasingly tied to the honor of the male household. Respectable women were veiled and secluded, while women detached from patriarchal protection could be treated as sexually available. Graeber argues that veiling was not simply an ancient religious custom. It distinguished women incorporated into honorable households from slaves, prostitutes, and others exposed to the market. This produced a paradox. The patriarch's honor rested on protecting women from commodification, but the same legal order often gave him the power to pledge or alienate them. Market penetration strengthened a defensive ideal of family purity, while debt made families vulnerable to disintegration. Ancient Greece intensified these tensions. Early Greek society joined aristocratic honor, competitive gift-giving, raiding, debt, and slavery. Coinage later spread through the military coinage system, while debt bondage threatened small farmers. In Athens, Solon's reforms canceled debts and prohibited the enslavement of citizens for debt. Political freedom for citizens was therefore defined partly against the condition of slaves. Democracy did not abolish slavery. It created a sharper division between free citizens, who possessed political voice and could not be owned, and slaves, who were socially dead and subject to command. Graeber emphasizes that Greek freedom was not originally the modern ideal of unconstrained choice. It meant membership in a community of equals and protection from subjection to another person. Greek philosophy also reflected suspicion toward commerce. Markets encouraged comparison and calculation, while citizenship was associated with self-sufficiency and public virtue. Yet the city depended on coinage, tribute, war, and slave labor. The ideal of equal citizens rested on an excluded population that performed much of the work. Rome supplied many of the legal concepts that later shaped Western thought. Roman law developed an exceptionally absolute idea of private property, dominium, modeled on the master's power over a slave. Ownership meant the right to use, exclude, damage, or destroy. The clearest object of such power was another human being stripped of independent rights. Roman freedom was defined as the opposite of slavery, but the two concepts shared a legal structure. The free person was imagined as self-owning, someone subject to no master. Later theories of liberty inherited this image. To be free came to mean possessing oneself as property. The Roman household intensified the connection. The paterfamilias held extensive authority over descendants and dependents. Children could remain legally subordinate even as adults. Debt, paternal power, and ownership converged in a system where autonomy belonged primarily to the household head. Graeber argues that modern liberalism retains these Roman foundations. The language of natural rights treats each individual as the owner of a body, labor, and capacities. Contracts are legitimate because self-owners may temporarily sell the use of their labor. Freedom becomes the ability to dispose of oneself and one's property. This framework has emancipatory power because it rejects direct ownership by others. It also contains a contradiction. If freedom is self-ownership, then liberty is defined using the same absolute property relation that slavery made possible. Human autonomy is modeled on the master's power, turned inward. Debt occupies the unstable middle. Creditor and debtor begin as equal persons capable of contracting. Until repayment, however, the creditor acquires claims over the debtor's future actions. In extreme cases, those claims approach ownership. The contract between equals creates a temporary hierarchy that can become permanent when obligations compound. Graeber's larger conclusion is that contemporary civilization did not emerge from the gradual expansion of peaceful exchange. Its central concepts were shaped through conflicts over slavery, debt bondage, patriarchal authority, military power, and the limits of ownership. Honor, credit, freedom, and property remain morally charged because they carry this history within them. The Irish honor price system shows how a society can quantify dignity without creating a universal market in persons. Compensation varied by rank, and certain acts injured not merely a body but a public standing. Satire, insult, refusal of hospitality, and violations of protection could all damage honor. The law converted these injuries into payments while preserving a hierarchical map of society. Mesopotamian reforms reveal another side. When rulers canceled debts, they restored the patriarchal household as the basic political unit. This protected free men from creditors but did not establish equality within the household. Wives, children, and servants remained under male authority. The clean slate prevented one patriarch from absorbing another's dependence, while reinforcing the patriarch's control over them. Graeber links the spread of veiling to this distinction between protected and market-exposed women. Respectability meant incorporation into a household whose male head could defend its members. Prostitutes and slaves were denied the veil because they lacked that protected status. The symbol expressed resistance to commodification, but it did so by intensifying patriarchal control. Greek debt conflicts transformed the political meaning of freedom. When citizens could no longer be enslaved for unpaid loans, slavery did not disappear. it was displaced onto foreigners captured or purchased elsewhere. The equal male citizen became imaginable alongside the absolute subordination of the slave. Democracy and slavery expanded together, rather than representing opposite stages. Roman law made the contrast even more systematic. The slave was a thing over which the owner exercised dominion. The free citizen was someone who was not such a thing. Later, jurists and philosophers converted this opposition into a theory of rights, in which each person possesses himself. The language of self-possession still frames debates over labor, bodily autonomy, and contract. Graeber does not argue that modern freedom is therefore false. He argues that its legal imagination is historically narrow. Freedom could also mean the ability to form relationships, participate in collective decisions, or act without arbitrary command. Defining it primarily as ownership of oneself makes every activity potentially alienable and encourages the idea that a person can legitimately sell any capacity through contract. Graeber deepens the analysis by defining slavery as social death. The slave is not merely an unpaid worker. Capture removes the person from ancestry, kinship, legal personality, and the capacity to make binding promises independently of a master. In many traditions, enslavement was understood as an alternative to death. A prisoner, condemned criminal, or starving debtor survived physically only by losing the social identity that had previously made life meaningful. This is why slave status was associated with degradation, even when a slave performed prestigious work or exercised authority on behalf of a ruler. The master's honor was the inverse of this degradation. The ability to strip others of standing became evidence of one's own power. Aristocratic honor, therefore, combined self-assurance with extreme sensitivity to insult. A slight suggested that the honorable man might be treated as an equal, a dependent, or even as someone who could be degraded. Debts of honor had to be answered, because failure to respond threatened the public distinction between those who commanded and those who could be commanded. Early Irish law offers a particularly revealing case. Compensation was often denominated in the cumul, the unit originally associated with a female slave, even when actual payment was made in cattle, silver objects, grain, or other goods. Graeber asks why a society in which slavery was declining continued to measure dignity through slave girl units. His answer is that the unit preserved a memory of the ultimate power behind honor, the ability to detach a person from her relations and convert her into an anonymous object of transfer. This does not mean that Irish legal payments were ordinary market prices. The honor price depended on rank and was invoked for insults, injury, violations of hospitality, and breaches of protection. A poet's satire could diminish a king because reputation was a political resource. The monetary unit mapped a hierarchy of persons, rather than creating a market in interchangeable individuals. Yet the very possibility of measurement rested on a background in which human beings had once been traded. Graeber then links heroic literature to this moral structure. Heroes acquire fame by taking trophies, captives, and dependents from others. In the Iliad, Achilles can describe Briseis both as a woman he loves and as a prize won by his spear after the destruction of her family. Intimacy and domination are not opposites in this world. The conqueror's ability to absorb a defeated person into his household confirms his greatness. The same logic illuminates the peculiar resemblance between kings and slaves. Ordinary people are defined by many commitments to relatives, neighbors, and communities. Slaves are stripped of such independent ties, while kings claim to stand above them. Rulers often surround themselves with slaves, eunuchs, or foreign retainers, because such servants are presumed to possess no competing loyalties. At the extremes of hierarchy, both sovereign and slave appear as isolated persons defined primarily by relations of command. Graeber's final target is the modern image of the self-owning individual. Roman law defined property through dominium, an unusually absolute power of use and abuse most clearly exercised over slaves. Modern theories of liberty then reverse the position. A free person is one who owns himself and cannot be owned by another. This move condemns slavery, but it retains the master-slave relation inside the individual. The mind is imagined as commanding the body, and labor becomes something the owner of the self may sell temporarily. For Graeber, this helps explain why the wage contract can be represented as freedom, even though it creates obedience for much of the day. The worker has not sold the whole person, only a measured portion of time and capacity. Yet the conceptual model remains alienation. Something that forms part of a person is detached, priced, and placed under another's authority. Modern rights protect people against total alienation, but they often do so by defining which portions of the self may still be legitimately transferred. Chapter 8. Credit versus bullion and the cycles of history. Graeber now turns from conceptual analysis to a 5,000-year historical sequence. His organizing distinction is between periods dominated by virtual credit money and periods dominated by coins and bullion. These forms coexist, but one or the other can shape the character of an age. Credit systems depend on trust, memory, institutions, and the expectation of future relations. They therefore flourish in relatively stable settings, where communities or authorities can regulate obligations. Bullion is especially useful in conditions of war, plunder, slavery, and transactions among strangers. Gold and silver do not require confidence in the issuer. They can be carried away and accepted across borders. Graeber proposes a recurring relationship between armies, coinage, taxes, and markets. States obtain metal, mint coins, pay soldiers, and demand taxes in the same currency. Subjects then sell goods to soldiers or to others who need coins. War creates captives who can be sold, while conquest opens mines and supplies bullion. The market is not the peaceful alternative to state violence. In many periods, it is organized through that violence. The First Great Age, from roughly 3500 to 800 BC, was dominated by credit. Mesopotamian temples and palaces established units of account and maintained ledgers. Silver measured obligations, but grain, labor, animals, or other goods could settle them. Private, interest-bearing loans developed alongside institutional accounts, repeatedly producing crises in which farmers lost land and family members. Mesopotamian rulers responded with clean slates. They canceled personal debts, freed debt servants, restored land, and destroyed records. These decrees did not normally erase commercial loans among merchants. Their purpose was to preserve the social base of the kingdom by preventing creditors from absorbing the free farming population. Debt cancellation became part of royal renewal and cosmic restoration. Egypt provides a contrast. Its centralized bureaucracy collected taxes and distributed resources directly. Money again functioned mainly as a unit of account, but interest-bearing private debt was less important for much of Egyptian history. Without the same reliance on official lending, Egypt experienced fewer large-scale debt crises. Loans existed, and default could bring punishment, but the Mesopotamian pattern developed later and less intensely. Early China combined social currencies, gifts, commodity valuables, and credit records. Later legends claimed that benevolent rulers created money to rescue families forced to sell children during disasters. Whether historically accurate or not, the stories connected currency with public relief and the prevention of debt catastrophe. State granaries and redistribution were presented as safeguards against dependency. From these examples, Graeber derives his broad chronology. The first agrarian empires relied heavily on virtual money. The Axial Age, from about 800 BC to 600 AD, was the great era of coinage, warfare, and slavery. The Middle Ages returned toward credit and moral restrictions on lending. The age of capitalist empires, beginning around 1450, joined bullion, colonial violence, public debt, and expanding commercial credit. The period after 1971 marks a new age of virtual money whose final institutions remain unsettled. Chapter 9. The Axial Age, 800 BC to 600 AD. The Axial Age is known for the near-simultaneous emergence of Greek philosophy, the Hebrew prophetic tradition, Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism, Taoism, and other schools that continued to shape world thought. Graeber links this intellectual transformation to an equally striking monetary change, the spread of coinage in the Mediterranean, India, and China. The first coins appeared in Lydia and the Greek cities of Asia Minor around the 7th and 6th centuries BC. India developed punchmark silver, while Chinese states produced bronze pieces shaped like knives, spades, and cowries. In each region, private forms appeared first, but governments quickly monopolized minting. Graeber argues that coinage spread less because merchants required it than because states needed to maintain armies. Long-distance merchants were already comfortable with credit, ingots, and bills. Professional soldiers and mercenaries were different. They needed portable payment that could be divided, carried, and spent far from the ruler who hired them. Coins offered a share of plunder in standardized form. Governments could then demand taxes in their own coins. Taxation obliged the population to supply goods and services to soldiers in order to obtain the currency. A military coinage slavery complex emerged. Conquest provided treasure and captives. Mines produced metal through forced labor. Mints paid troops. Taxation created markets, and markets provisioned further conquest. In the Mediterranean, Greek city-states combined citizen armies, coinage, maritime trade, debt conflict, and slavery. Solon's reforms in Athens canceled debts and ended debt slavery for citizens, but the economy increasingly relied on foreign slaves. Freedom inside the citizen body was secured partly by transferring coercion to outsiders. The Persian and later Hellenistic empires expanded the use of coins across vast territories. Alexander's conquests released temple treasure, paid armies, and created new markets. The Roman Republic and Empire intensified the pattern. Military expansion produced immense numbers of slaves, extracted tribute, and circulated coin throughout the Mediterranean. Mines, plantations, and urban markets depended on coerced labor. India followed a related path. The great kingdoms maintained armies and tax systems, while coinage spread alongside urban markets. Political treatises such as the Arthashastra described a state that supervised production, taxation, espionage, commerce, and war, with unsentimental calculation. Slavery existed, though its forms differed from the Mediterranean, and debt remained a source of dependency. In China, the warring states competed through administrative centralization, mass armies, coinage, taxation, and agricultural expansion. Legalist thinkers treated society as an instrument of state power. The Qin unified the realm through severe discipline, standard measures, and centralized authority. The Han later moderated this system while retaining many of its institutions. Graeber sees a parallel between the new material economies and the philosophical debates of the age. Coins are pieces of matter bearing an abstract social value. They make unlike objects commensurable and appear to embody a universal substance beneath particular forms. At the same time, philosophers in Greece, India, and China began asking whether reality itself consisted of a basic substance, and whether appearances concealed a deeper order. Materialist schools presented human behavior in terms of advantage, power, pleasure, and physical substance. Greek sophists, Indian materialists, Chinese legalists, and authors of statecraft often describe politics without appeal to sacred tradition. They treated rulers, subjects, and resources as calculable elements. The world religions and ethical philosophies can be understood partly as responses to this environment. Where markets isolated material acquisition as a distinct sphere, religious teachers created another sphere devoted to ultimate value. They criticized greed, violence, attachment, and the illusion of the autonomous self. Charity became a central virtue. Pure self-interest and pure generosity emerged as conceptual opposites. Buddhism rejected attachment and offered monastic communities modeled partly on republican assemblies. Jainism made nonviolence an absolute discipline. Hebrew prophets condemned usury, enslavement, and the sale of the poor for silver. Christianity preached forgiveness, release, and a kingdom beyond imperial power. Confucianism subordinated profit to ethical cultivation and social responsibility. Taoism questioned artificial distinctions and coercive government. Graeber does not reduce these movements to economic reactions. He argues that their institutional forms cannot be separated from the worlds of war, coinage, slavery, and debt in which they arose. The promise of spiritual liberation made particular sense in societies where political and economic life had become intensely material, impersonal, and violent. As empires reached the limits of expansion, rulers adopted the new teachings. Ashoka embraced Buddhism after the violence of conquest. Constantine allied the Roman state with Christianity. Han rulers made Confucianism an official doctrine. Ethical and religious authorities began tempering the military-commercial order. Over time, warfare declined in some regions, and slavery became less central across much of Eurasia. Religious institutions gained authority over lending, charity, and the treatment of the poor. The Axial Age's stark division between material markets and transcendent ethics prepared the transition to the medieval world, where the two spheres would be recombined. Graeber connects the spread of coinage to the simultaneous rise of professional armies and impersonal markets. Governments needed portable objects with standardized value to pay soldiers far from home. Soldiers then spent coins among civilians, while rulers demanded taxes in the same coins, ensuring that subjects would supply goods to the military. Conquest produced bullion through plunder, and mines were often worked by slaves or convicts. Coinage, taxation, warfare, and slavery thus reinforced one another. The Mediterranean city-states illustrate the political tension created by this system. Debt crises threatened to reduce citizens to bondage, while military competition required large bodies of independent men capable of bearing arms. Reforms such as those associated with Solon protected citizens from debt slavery, but the labor and commodification previously imposed on citizens were increasingly displaced onto foreigners and captives. The political community of equals was built beside an expanding market in enslaved outsiders. Graeber sees a parallel between material and intellectual change. The new bullion economies encourage people to imagine reality as composed of uniform substances that could be counted, divided, and recombined. Greek atomism, Indian materialism, and Chinese debates about matter emerged in worlds where coinage made abstract equivalents an everyday experience. He does not claim that coins mechanically cause philosophy. He argues that monetary practices supplied persuasive models for thinking about substance, individuality, and value. At the same time, the great ethical and religious movements of the period rejected the moral consequences of calculation. Buddhism, Jainism, Greek philosophy, prophetic Judaism, Christianity, and Chinese traditions ask how human beings could escape cycles of violence, desire, and obligation. Their answers differed, but many treated worldly debt as an inadequate model for ultimate moral life. The axial age, therefore, united materialism and transcendence. Expanding cash markets made the world appear calculable, while religious teachers searched for forms of truth and liberation beyond calculation. Chapter 10. The Middle Ages, 600 AD to 1450 AD. Graeber presents the Middle Ages not as a universal collapse into barter, but as a broad return to credit money after the decline of ancient empires. Coinage diminished in many regions because the military systems that had distributed metal weakened. Accounts, loans, tallies, checks, and promises continued. Economic life became more closely regulated by religious and moral authorities. The rupture of the military coinage-slavery complex was, for much of the population, an improvement. Ancient cities and armies had required enormous extraction from the countryside. Their decline reduced some forms of taxation, plantation slavery, and mass warfare. Medieval peasants could still be exploited by landlords, but Graeber argues that their position was often better than that of cultivators under the great ancient empires. He begins in India. After the Mauryan Empire, political authority fragmented, and rulers increasingly compensated soldiers and officials with land rather than coin. Cities contracted and fewer coins circulated, but sophisticated credit arrangements remained. Legal texts discussed mortgages, sureties, interest, and compound obligations. Buddhist monasteries accumulated wealth through donations and perpetual endowments. A donor could provide capital that the monastery lent out, with the interest permanently funding lamps, meals, rituals, or maintenance. Gold and silver migrated from circulation into sacred treasuries, images, and ornaments. Religious institutions became financial centers without relying primarily on coin exchange. Over time, Buddhism declined in much of India, while Brahmin authorities helped construct a more rigidly hierarchical rural order. Society was organized through caste and hereditary occupation. Graeber describes this as a flight into hierarchy. Rather than allow debts among formerly equal persons to destabilize the order, social difference was made explicit and permanent. Obligations were embedded in rank. China followed another path. Imperial governments remained stronger and repeatedly intervened in markets, granaries, prices, and credit. Coin shortages encouraged the use of paper instruments, bills, and local accounts. Merchants developed extensive networks, while the state alternated between supporting commerce and fearing concentrations of private power. Buddhism became economically central. Monasteries received donations, owned land, operated mills, maintained treasuries, made loans, and offered refuge. The religious language of karma portrayed existence itself as an accumulation of debts across lives. Donations generated merit and helped discharge obligations to parents, ancestors, and all sentient beings. Graeber calls this an economy of infinite debt. A child could never repay the milk and care received from a mother. Buddhist texts magnified this into immeasurable obligations extending through countless rebirths. Monasteries offered rituals and donations as methods of transferring merit, but the debt could never be fully calculated. These institutions sometimes became so wealthy that governments confiscated their property and suppressed monasteries. The state's concern was both fiscal and political. Religious wealth removed metal and land from taxation, while monasteries created autonomous networks of authority. Chinese governments, therefore, attempted to preserve a balance among commerce, religious institutions, and imperial control. The Islamic world offers Graeber's clearest example of a prosperous credit economy without modern capitalism. Islamic law prohibited usury, understood as guaranteed gain on a loan, but treated trade and profit as honorable. Merchants could form partnerships in which investors shared risk. Commercial credit, checks, bills, and long-distance networks flourished from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The moral distinction was between profit earned through risk and return extracted without exposure. A lender demanding fixed interest claimed gain regardless of the outcome, while a partner shared both profit and loss. This encouraged flexible commercial arrangements and made personal reputation essential. A merchant's honor and credit were closely connected. Graeber notes that Islamic markets were often less directly managed by government than European ones would later become. Contracts were enforced through law, custom, and reputation, but rulers did not normally create chartered corporations with state-granted monopolies. Large merchants accumulated capital, yet investment remained tied to persons and partnerships rather than immortal legal entities. This helps explain why sophisticated Islamic finance did not produce the specific institutions of European capitalism. Commercial actors took market risk seriously, while legal and moral rules limited guaranteed returns. The state did not routinely combine merchant privilege, corporate monopoly, and armed expansion in the later European manner. Western Christendom developed more slowly. After Rome, coins became scarce, but people continued to calculate values in inherited units and to transact through credit. Manorial accounts, notch tallies, household tabs, and promises allowed exchange without much cash. The phrase reversion to barter obscures these arrangements. The Church condemned usury, especially lending at interest to the poor. The prohibition was frequently evaded, inconsistently enforced, and entangled with anti-Jewish restrictions that pushed some Jewish communities into lending roles while excluding them from land and guild occupations. Christian rulers could then tax, expel, or cancel debts to Jewish lenders for political advantage. At the same time, Europe developed distinctive corporate forms. Monasteries, universities, towns, guilds, and churches were recognized as legal persons capable of owning property beyond the lifetime of individual members. These entities were not initially profit-seeking firms, but they supplied a legal model for organizations that could accumulate assets, make contracts, and survive indefinitely. Military religious orders and merchant associations combined collective identity with finance. The Knights Templar transferred funds, protected travelers, and maintained international accounts. Italian merchants used bills of exchange and partnership arrangements to move credit across fairs and cities. Much long-distance trade remained virtual, even when coins were scarce. Graeber emphasizes that the medieval moral economy did not eliminate exploitation. Serfdom, hierarchy, religious persecution, and war persisted. The significant change was institutional. Across much of Eurasia, religious authorities restricted creditor power, encouraged almsgiving, and treated economic activity as part of a moral order, rather than an autonomous sphere. The age also transformed the meaning of symbols and promises. A tally split between two parties represented an agreement. A charter or seal embodied authority. Theological discussions of signs, sacraments, and invisible corporate bodies paralleled the expanding use of abstract credit and legal personality. By the end of the period, Europe possessed corporations, merchant guilds, war-making states, and sophisticated credit techniques. What it did not yet possess was capitalism in the modern sense. that emerged when corporate organization and finance were joined to armed overseas expansion, state-backed monopolies, wage discipline, and the expectation of endless accumulation. Graeber's general conclusion is that the Middle Ages were an age of virtual money and moral supervision. India moved toward caste hierarchy. China combined markets with state management and Buddhist finance. Islam built extensive credit networks around risk-sharing, and Europe developed corporate persons and commercial instruments. These different paths would converge violently after 1450 in the age of capitalist empires. Graeber gives particular attention to the contrast between medieval Islamic commerce and later European capitalism. Muslim merchants used partnerships in which one party supplied capital and another traveled or conducted business. Profit was divided according to agreement, while losses generally fell on the investor unless the managing partner had acted improperly. This structure distinguished legitimate gain from usury by tying return to shared exposure. The moral problem was not profit itself, but the demand for a guaranteed increase without accepting commercial risk. Long-distance Islamic trade, therefore, depended heavily on reputation. A merchant could issue instructions, letters, checks, and promises that would be honored across large distances, because partners belonged to overlapping legal and religious communities. Courts existed, but commerce did not depend on a state granting one company a monopoly and arming it to conquer markets. Graeber argues that this absence matters. Capital could be accumulated, but it did not automatically become an immortal corporate power compelled to expand without limit. Chinese Buddhism developed a different relation between religion and finance. Monasteries accumulated donations, made loans, operated mills and pawn shops, and maintained treasuries. The idea of karmic debt could be extended across generations and rebirths. Texts describe the child's debt to a mother as literally incalculable. Even carrying her on one's shoulders for years could not repay the milk and care received. Donations to monasteries created merit, but they did not finally settle the infinite obligation. Economic techniques were absorbed into a religious language that emphasized the impossibility of complete repayment. This wealth also provoked political reaction. Chinese governments periodically confiscated monastic property, returned monks to lay status, and attempted to bring land and metal back under taxation. The conflicts demonstrate that virtual money did not imply weak states. Imperial authorities could supervise markets, issue currency, regulate grain supplies, and intervene against private or religious concentrations of power. Credit and state administration expanded together, though in a different configuration from the military coinage systems of antiquity. In Western Europe, Christian prohibitions on usury created a persistent distinction between lending to assist someone in need and investing in a productive venture. The line was constantly disputed. Merchants designed bills of exchange, partnerships, penalties for late payment, and currency conversions that could conceal interest. The point was not simply hypocrisy. Economic actors were trying to preserve a moral world in which money should not reproduce itself merely because time had passed. The treatment of Jewish lenders reveals the violence inside this arrangement. Christian rulers restricted Jewish communities from owning land or entering many occupations, while permitting or encouraging them to lend. The same rulers could then tax them heavily, cancel debts owed to them, or expel them. Popular hostility toward creditors was redirected toward a vulnerable minority whose legal position had been created by political authority. Graeber uses this history to show that supposedly private credit relations were repeatedly organized by states. The European corporation also emerged in this period, but not first as a business firm. Towns, monasteries, churches, guilds, and universities became legal persons that could own property, make decisions, and survive the death of their members. The idea of an invisible, enduring body had theological and legal roots. It later supplied a structure that commercial enterprises could adopt, especially when joined to sovereign charters and overseas violence. Across Eurasia, then, the Middle Ages were not economically primitive. They produced complex accounts, checks, bills, partnerships, legal persons, and international trading networks. What distinguished the period from the capitalist age was the surrounding moral and political architecture. Religious institutions claimed authority to limit interest, protect debtors, require charity, and subordinate commerce to broader social purposes. These restraints were inconsistent and often oppressive in their own ways, but they prevented the economy from being imagined as an autonomous domain governed solely by accumulation. Chapter 11. Age of the Great Capitalist Empires, 1450 to 1971. Graeber begins the modern era with a reversal of late medieval prosperity. After the Black Death reduced Europe's population, workers gained bargaining power, wages rose, and popular festivals expanded. Authorities attempted to freeze wages and restrict consumption, but ordinary people resisted. By the 16th century, however, living standards declined and a new regime of discipline emerged. The usual explanation is the price revolution caused by American gold and silver. Graeber accepts that the influx of bullion mattered, but argues that metal alone cannot explain the transformation. The crucial issue was who controlled it and how that control was used. Governments, bankers, and large merchants declared precious metal to be the privileged form of payment while continuing to create credit for their own operations. Local systems of trust were weakened, taxes were demanded in cash, and people were pushed into labor markets to obtain it. The process joined European conquest to Asian demand. Portugal entered the Indian Ocean with armed ships and replaced existing traditions of relatively peaceful trade with bombardment, fortified ports, and protection payments. Spain conquered the Americas, seized treasure, and forced indigenous and African laborers into mines and plantations. American silver crossed both the Atlantic and the Pacific, much of it flowing toward China, where taxes increasingly had to be paid in silver. Graeber presents the emerging world economy as a fusion of war, debt, and commerce. Conquistadors were often deeply indebted. Their expeditions had to generate extraordinary returns to satisfy investors and creditors. This financial pressure encouraged relentless searches for gold and tribute. Violence was not an accidental excess committed during otherwise rational trade. It was built into enterprises whose debts could be repaid only through conquest. The destruction of indigenous societies, the Potosi silver mines, plantation slavery, and the Atlantic slave trade supplied the bullion and commodities that reorganized global finance. Europe's comparative advantage was not superior commercial morality or production. It was the capacity to combine naval warfare, chartered companies, public borrowing, and legal monopoly. Inside Europe, enclosures removed peasants from common lands. Laws against vagabonds criminalized people who had lost access to subsistence. Authorities impressed, imprisoned, transported, or forced them to work. Colonial labor and domestic wage discipline grew together. The supposedly free labor market was created through political coercion. Graeber stresses that ordinary people still relied on credit. Villagers, shopkeepers, and workers kept tabs and settled accounts periodically. Coins might be scarce even as values were calculated in money. The new order did not replace credit with cash. It divided credit into unequal worlds. Within communities, credit depended on reputation and ongoing relations. At the level of states and large enterprises, impersonal credit expanded through bonds, bills, banks, and corporate shares. The powerful could create promises on a vast scale, while the poor faced increasingly harsh enforcement for small obligations. The English financial revolution illustrates the change. The Bank of England was founded through a loan to the government. In return, creditors received interest backed by future taxes and notes that could circulate as money. Public debt became the foundation of private money creation. The state borrowed to wage war, and the financial claims generated by that borrowing became assets for investors. Graeber emphasizes the paradox. Money appeared to be a promise issued by the government, yet the promise was secured by taxing the population. The national debt linked citizens to an indefinite future. Unlike ancient clean slates, modern public debt was expected to continue permanently. Creditors did not want repayment of the principal so much as a reliable stream of interest. Chartered corporations joined this financial system to imperial power. Companies received monopolies, raised capital, fielded armed forces, governed territory, and pursued profit beyond the lifespan of any member. The East India Companies were not merely merchants. They were state-like institutions able to conquer, tax, and borrow. Graeber, therefore, resists definitions of capitalism as simple market exchange. Markets existed in many societies that did not become capitalist. Capitalism depends on the organization of money and production around continual growth. Investors advance funds with the expectation of receiving more, then reinvest the gain. Firms must expand, reduce costs, and generate returns or disappear. This compulsion toward endless accumulation distinguishes capital from ordinary wealth. A merchant can become rich and retire. Capital must continue moving. Credit creates claims on future production. and competition turns those claims into commands over present labor. The system continually mortgages the future. Wage labor appears formally free because workers are not owned. Yet people separated from land, tools, and independent means of subsistence must sell their time. The labor contract is an agreement between legal equals that creates hierarchy during the working day. As with debt, equality produces temporary subordination, and economic necessity can make it effectively permanent. Graeber also traces a conflict between older moral understandings and the new calculation. Popular movements demanded access to commons, relief from debt, fair prices, and the right to live without total submission to work. Elites increasingly portrayed poverty as a moral failure and disciplined the poor through workhouses, prisons, and wage dependence. The modern ideal of self-interest developed within this struggle. Earlier thinkers had treated greed as a vice. Political economy recast the pursuit of gain as predictable and potentially useful. If institutions were designed correctly, private ambition could produce public prosperity. Graeber argues that this transformation did not simply discover an eternal human motive. It created environments in which people were compelled to behave as calculating actors. At the same time, capitalism generated apocalyptic expectations. Religious movements anticipated the end of the world. Radicals expected social revolution. Investors feared national bankruptcy. Governments imagined collapse if debts were not honored. The financial system promised limitless future growth, while repeatedly producing crises that made the future appear about to end. The national debt embodied both optimism and threat. It assumed that governments, taxes, and economic expansion would continue indefinitely. It also financed increasingly destructive wars. Enlightenment reformers understood that public credit could support representative government, but many feared that accumulated obligations would end in default, dictatorship, or revolution. Graeber argues that capitalism often functions best when its permanence remains uncertain. Credit is a claim on the future, and if the system is imagined as literally endless, the temptation is to create claims without limit. Speculative manias and financial crashes arise when institutions act as though future expansion is guaranteed. By the 20th century, states, corporations, and banks had built an immense structure of credit, resting on taxation, wage labor, empire, and military power. The formal gold standard did not eliminate virtual money. It organized confidence around a promise of convertibility. In 1971, that final link was broken, opening a new period in which global money became almost entirely credit. Graeber presents the conquest of the Americas as a debt-financed enterprise from the beginning. Conquistadors often arrived, owing money for ships, equipment, horses, and provisions. Investors expected returns, while officers promised followers shares of anticipated treasure. The search for gold and silver was therefore driven not only by greed in the abstract, but by contracts that converted imagined future plunder into present obligations. When expected riches failed to appear, expedition leaders intensified extraction, seized labor, and pursued new conquests. The destruction of indigenous valuables illustrates the transformation from human to commercial economies. Objects made of precious metal often embodied ancestors, gods, political histories, or ritual relationships. Conquerors melted them into standardized bullion, whose value depended precisely on the erasure of that history. Graeber argues that the first people to view every object only as a quantity obtainable on a market are not peaceful traders, but thieves, soldiers, and debt collectors, because they encounter things already severed from the relations that gave them meaning. American silver entered a world system centered partly on China. European powers desired Asian goods but produced relatively little that Chinese merchants wanted. Silver supplied the means of payment, especially after Chinese fiscal reforms increased the demand for the metal. Mines, such as Potosi, relied on coerced labor under lethal conditions, while mercury processing poisoned workers and surrounding communities. The apparently neutral flow of bullion therefore condensed imperial violence on several continents. Within Europe, the move toward cash taxation and the enclosure of common land forced more people to obtain money through wages. Earlier village credit had allowed neighbors to maintain running accounts and settle periodically. Authorities increasingly privileged coin and legally enforceable claims, while criminalizing vagrancy and punishing those who lacked employers. The labor market was not simply released from feudal restrictions. It was constructed by removing alternative means of subsistence and by using police power to discipline the displaced. The English financial revolution made the relation between public debt and money especially visible. Investors lent to the crown, future taxes guaranteed the interest, and the Bank of England issued notes against government obligations. The national debt was not a temporary emergency expected to disappear. It became a permanent foundation for financial assets. Creditors could hold claims on future taxes, trade those claims, and use them as the basis for further lending. This system allowed states to mobilize resources for war on an unprecedented scale. Governments with credible tax systems could borrow more cheaply and defeat rulers who depended on immediate treasure. Public credit and representative institutions could therefore reinforce one another, but the result was not peaceful commerce. It was an increasingly effective war machine, whose liabilities became the raw material of private finance. Chartered companies carried this fusion overseas. The English and Dutch East India companies could issue shares, borrow, maintain troops, negotiate treaties, tax populations, and administer conquered territory. Their corporate form separated ownership from personal responsibility and allowed the enterprise to continue indefinitely. Graeber sees this as crucial to capitalism. The organization does not accumulate in order to reach sufficiency. It must continually generate returns, expand, and defend its market position. The discipline of wage labor reproduced the debt relation in another form. Employer and worker meet as legal equals and agree on a price. During the contracted period, however, the worker submits to commands concerning activity, pace, and use of time. Because access to land and independent livelihood has been restricted, this formally temporary submission can become a permanent condition of life. The contract abolishes personal bondage while preserving a measured alienation of freedom. Graeber also emphasizes the religious and apocalyptic imagination surrounding capitalism. Public credit requires confidence that taxes, states, and economic expansion will continue into an indefinite future. At the same time, the period was filled with predictions of catastrophe, revolution, national bankruptcy, and final judgment. Capitalism repeatedly treated the future as both an inexhaustible field for claims and a horizon that might suddenly collapse. The gold standard did not eliminate this structure of promises. Most transactions still relied on bank credit, bills, and accounts, with gold functioning as a guarantee at the edge of the system. Convertibility disciplined some governments and debtors, but it was suspended during wars and crises whenever political survival required it. The age of bullion was therefore never a simple return to metallic money. It was a credit order organized around the symbolic and geopolitical authority of metal. Chapter 12, The Beginning of Something Yet to Be Determined, 1971 to the Present. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of foreign-held dollars into gold. The Bretton Woods system had treated the dollar as the central international currency, exchangeable by foreign governments at a fixed gold price. Nixon's decision created the regime of floating currencies that continues into the period covered by the book. Graeber interprets this not as the disappearance of political backing, but as a change in its form. The dollar remained the principal reserve currency because governments, banks, and commodity markets continued to accept it. Oil was priced in dollars, and states held U.S. Treasury securities as reserves. American military power helped sustain this arrangement. Foreign central banks effectively financed U.S. deficits by purchasing government debt. Many major holders were American allies hosting U.S. forces, or depending on American security. Graeber describes this as debt imperialism. The dominant state could borrow in its own currency and issue the assets that others needed for reserves. This arrangement inverted ordinary creditor morality. The world's most powerful debtor enjoyed exceptional freedom, while poorer debtors were subjected to strict repayment. The International Monetary Fund and related institutions required governments to cut public services, privatize assets, open markets, and prioritize creditors. Default was presented as a threat to the global order. The age of virtual money therefore began with institutions protecting creditors rather than debtors. Historically, Graeber argues, credit periods often created mechanisms such as clean slates, usury restrictions, and religious protections to prevent obligations from destroying society. The post-1971 order initially moved in the opposite direction. Debt expanded into daily life. Wages stagnated in many wealthy countries, but households gained access to mortgages, credit cards, student loans, and financial investments. Workers were invited to become small property owners and investors, while also becoming long-term debtors. Consumption was sustained through borrowing, rather than rising income. The political settlement after the Second World War had offered some workers stable employment, public services, pensions, and the prospect of home ownership. Movements for civil rights, national liberation, and women's equality demanded wider inclusion. Graeber argues that by the 1970s, the system confronted a crisis. The benefits promised to a limited group could not be extended universally without changing the distribution of power. The response was a shift toward finance. Governments deregulated capital, weakened labor, privatized public functions, and promoted asset ownership. Rather than giving workers greater control over production, the new order tied them to homes, retirement accounts, and debt payments. Financial participation substituted for economic security. Graeber challenges the claim that this was a withdrawal of government. Neoliberalism produced extensive administration, surveillance, legal enforcement, and bureaucratic control. States protected property claims, rescued financial institutions, managed borders, and disciplined debtors. Market rhetoric concealed a close alliance between public power and private finance. The 2008 crisis exposed the system. Banks had created complex claims based on mortgages and other debts, treating rising asset prices as permanent. When the claims failed, governments guaranteed institutions considered too large to collapse. Public money absorbed private losses. Many households lost homes or employment, but large-scale debt relief was rejected. Graeber sees the decision as moral and political, not merely technical. Authorities demonstrated that debts could be rewritten when powerful institutions were at risk. The refusal to offer similar relief to ordinary people showed whose promises the system treated as sacred. International resistance nevertheless weakened the creditor regime. East Asian governments accumulated reserves to avoid dependence on the IMF. Argentina defaulted and recovered more successfully than orthodox predictions suggested. Latin American movements rejected structural adjustment. Global justice campaigns challenged the legitimacy of debts accumulated under dictatorship or imposed through unequal contracts. Graeber is cautious about predicting the next system. 40 years is a short interval in a historical cycle that may last centuries. Virtual money could support new forms of cooperation and debtor protection, or it could intensify surveillance and dependency. The technology does not determine the political outcome. He returns to the moral question. Human beings are told that survival must be earned, and that those unable to pay deserve punishment. Yet no one creates a life, language, society, or world alone. The baseline communism of everyday existence means that people continually provide things because others need them and because cooperation is required for any community to function. Graeber proposes a modern jubilee as a serious possibility, broad cancellation of consumer and international debts, followed by institutions designed to prevent the immediate recreation of the same dependencies. The purpose would not be to reward irresponsibility, but to recognize that obligations have become unpayable and socially destructive. He does not propose abolishing every promise or all forms of accounting. He asks that society distinguish obligations that support human relations from debts that reduce people to instruments of accumulation. A promise deserves respect because of the relationship between persons, not because a quantified claim has an unlimited right to enforcement. The chapter ends with the idea that perhaps the world does owe people a living. The phrase is usually dismissed as entitlement, but Graeber reverses the moral assumption. A society capable of producing abundance should not force everyone to justify existence through submission to debt and labor discipline. People may owe one another care, freedom, and the conditions for a meaningful life more fundamentally than they owe financial payment. Graeber describes the post-war social settlement as a limited bargain between capital and parts of the working class. In return for accepting managerial authority and disciplined employment, many workers in wealthy countries received rising wages, social insurance, pensions, public education, and access to home ownership. Civil rights movements, anti-colonial struggles, and feminism then demanded that the security and dignity offered to a restricted group be extended more widely. Graeber interprets the crisis of the 1970s partly as a crisis of inclusion. Elites were unwilling or unable to universalize the bargain without surrendering greater control. The neoliberal response did not eliminate the state. It redirected state power. Labor protections weakened, but enforcement of contracts, intellectual property, borders, policing, and creditor claims intensified. Public services were privatized, yet governments remained responsible for creating markets, guaranteeing financial institutions, and managing the social consequences. Graeber argues that the apparent opposition between market and state conceals a unified administrative order. Ordinary people were offered a new promise. Wages might stagnate, but workers could own homes, pension funds, and financial assets. At the same time, they were encouraged to refinance mortgages, use credit cards, and borrow for education or medical care. The citizen became both a small investor and a debtor. Rising asset prices appeared to compensate for insecurity until the claims built on those prices collapsed. The deregulation of interest made the coercive dimension of the system more visible. Charges that earlier societies would have classified as usury became legally enforceable through courts, collection agencies, and police. Credit scoring, automated databases, and financial surveillance allowed institutions to classify people according to predicted obedience and profitability. Virtual money created opportunities for flexibility, but it also made obligations easier to monitor and extend through every part of life. For Graeber, the political possibility of a jubilee follows from the selective cancellation already practiced by the system. Central banks and governments can create money, restructure claims, and rescue institutions when elites judge it necessary. The question is not whether debts can be altered, but which debts will be honored, and whose lives will be reorganized around repayment. A democratic debt cancellation would make that political choice explicit rather than disguising it as an immutable economic law. Afterward, 2014. In the 2014 Afterward, Graeber reflects on the book's reception and on the political events that followed its original publication. He had intended to write a broad work of anthropology capable of influencing public debate after the financial crisis. The success of the book suggested that there was strong demand for historical arguments that reopened possibilities treated as impossible by conventional economics. He defends anthropology as especially suited to the task. Economists often approach history with fixed models of rational behavior, while historians may refuse to infer anything not directly documented. Anthropologists combine empirical evidence with comparison across many forms of social organization. They can show that arrangements presented as natural or inevitable are historically unusual. Graeber highlights one intellectual result. The myth of barter began to lose authority. Even central banks increasingly describe money as credit created through balance sheets rather than as a neutral commodity that emerged from primitive swapping. He treats this as a victory for a century of anthropological criticism, not merely for his own book. The Afterward also connects the argument to Occupy Wall Street. Graeber participated in planning the occupation, but initially tried to keep the movement separate from his book. In practice, many participants were refugees from student loans, mortgages, medical bills, and insecure employment. Debt became one of the movement's strongest organizing themes. Groups such as Strike Debt produced educational materials and experimented with the rolling jubilee, which purchased distressed debt cheaply and canceled it rather than collecting. The project demonstrated that the face value presented to debtors could be many times the price for which creditors sold the same claims. Graeber does not claim that these movements resolved the problem. He presents them as early efforts to create a debtor politics suited to the new age of virtual money. The long-term consequences of the financial crisis, Occupy, and organized debt resistance remained uncertain. He closes by returning to Adam Smith. Smith believed that the pursuit of wealth should have limits because people ultimately seek comfort, recognition, and the sympathetic regard of others. Endless accumulation would be pathological. Graeber contrasts this with a system that turns expansion into an institutional requirement. The book's final question is therefore not how to perfect a universal market of isolated individuals. It is how to recognize the many moral relations that already sustain life and to prevent debt from converting them into permanent domination. History shows repeated cycles of obligation, crisis, cancellation, and renewal. The present remains open because societies have reorganized debt before and can do so again. The Afterward also clarifies Graeber's method. He does not claim to provide a complete chronology of every monetary institution. He uses anthropology to widen the range of arrangements that count as economically possible. Where conventional accounts begin with isolated individuals and derive society from exchange, the historical evidence begins with people already embedded in obligations, authorities, and communities. Money then appears as one way of organizing those relations, not as their origin. Graeber treats the changing public description of money as significant. Central banks increasingly acknowledge that commercial banks create deposits when they lend, and that repayment destroys part of that money. This did not settle the political argument, but it weakened the image of money as a scarce substance that governments merely redistribute. Once money is understood as a network of promises, questions about authority, cancellation, and access to credit become unavoidable.